Okay, so we are now going to go a little bit deeper into the Anna Gibbs piece. So I'm going to continue reading quotes and responding as I go through. To rethink mimesis is not a simple as not simple mimicry or copying, dependent on vision, monkey see, monkey do, but a complex communicative process in which other sensory or affect modalities are centrally involved. What we are to gain from this is a better understanding of the role of mimetic communication in social processes, and especially of making or breaking of social bonds. These form the basis of a sense of belonging, and ultimately of the polis, as what forms the affective basis for political orders. And I was just thinking of the Charles Olson piece we did, polis, and how it's that finding that place in the world, to find your geographic location to where you have that sense of belonging, and from that position, from that privileged position, to start, relating with the world around you and start broadening the compass of the world that you engage with. I took a course in environmental geography with Dr. Fox at Mount Allison, and what we did was we were looking at place and how it's an inscribed relationship, of how when we find a place, based on the geography of that place, how we inscribe ourselves into it. So for example, in the New Brunswick, Nova Scotia area, the Acadians went and they created dikes which changed the geography of the landscape. But at the same time, how that geography and landscape inscribes itself on us as well, so that our lives are altered based on the geography and the environment in which we find ourselves. There was also an idea that I came up with that place is almost like a blank space. As an interior designer, I used to be an interior designer. One of the secrets that they tell you is to make the place that you're trying to sell a blank canvas. So you use whites, and that's why a lot of apartments are white or neutral tones, light to neutral tones, because you want someone to be able to walk into a space and to be able to project themselves into it, to picture themselves in that space. And the more blank the canvas is, the less, the more inviting. It's the more inviting, and it offers less resistance to the self, so it makes it something that a consumer would want to have. So I was thinking of Charles Olson's piece, to where he actually returned to his place of childhood, where he, for whatever reason, found that he belonged, and the process of mimesis that he went through, that communication, to where he wasn't just copying or mirroring or acting out mimicry with the people there, but they actually had this sensory connection, this bond. There was a social process that was taking place at the time, and so to where he was very much involved in the politics of the area, but had a real sense of belonging there, and they had a sense that he belonged to them. So there was like ownership on both sides of the actual geography of place, but also the people who made up the place, so the community. And I also think of Stanley Cavell and the work he's done with movies in the 40s, and about how mimicry plays a huge part, and he doesn't use the term, but it's that we find ourselves, and I had talked about this yesterday, but we find ourselves and learn about ourselves most in hard, honest communication with people that we have built this sense of belonging and the sense of trust and the sense of society, to where we feel like we could open up to them, and we have this hard, honest, rough conversations that actually challenge us and grow us, but in a way reconfirm us as an individual, as a thinking being, as a feeling being, as someone who does belong, as someone who does have place. So sometimes for me, place isn't necessarily a geographic location, but is very much about finding a person or those people that you're connected to, and that as a human and human beings being societal, social creatures is very much a big part of place. Continuing reading. At the heart of mimesis is affect contagion, the bioneurological means by which particular affects are transmitted from body to body. So we're kind of going back to the idea of contagion, that body language, which is a really good word to put in here. So it's something there's bioneurological about body language, and she's going to go into explaining that. Powerful purveyors of affect contagion, since they are communicated rapidly, automatically via the face, as well as the voice. This is because the distinct neurological profile of each affect is correlated with particular physical sensations, including muscular and glandular and skin responses. Every once in a while someone will make a comment, and it's very colloquial, it's very commonplace to say what that person did made the hair on, gave me goosebumps, or made the hair on the back of my neck rise up, or we actually do experience, and we can recognize that we have these experience of a muscular, glandular, skin, emotional, physical, psychological responses to body language by those common things that we say, where we actually recognize in the everyday. It's when it's put in a very abstract way that it becomes something we say, no, that's not, it's questionable, but it's part of everyday speak to recognize these things. Continue reading. Of particular interest is facial expressions, activation of a mimetic impulse in response to the facial expression of observers, tending to elicit the same effect in them, or affect in them. Affects are not private, obscure, internal, intestinal responses, but facial responses in communication that communicate and motivate at once, both publicly outward to the other and backward and inward to the one who smiles, or cries, or frowns, or sneers, or otherwise expresses his affects. And if you think of times when you've seen people talking and they will say something and it's kind of revolted them, the person they're speaking to will kind of cringe with them, or they'll mirror that expression. There'll definitely be something, and you can tell when it's genuine because they can really feel it. You can see the responses, like their skin may get a little bit red or flush, or the way their body will tighten up. It's not just a facial expression, but their whole body will respond. And every time a body responds in those certain ways, there's like this muscle memory, and where your body's chemistry remembers that that certain cringe. So it's kind of lined up with something that we already have a database for. So it taps into some of our suppressed or maybe readily available memories. And that's very Freudian. That's a Freudian analogy, kind of bringing Freud into the conversation here. Continuing, the face plays a central role in the expression and communication of affects, and its importance has only been applied to the pervasiveness of media in everyday life. It conjures both the discrete affects and the frequent attempts to mask them, the backed-up affect. So there's times when you can tell somebody's responding to something, or have you ever been having a private conversation, the person next to you, their facial features, or like sitting in a booth in a restaurant, and the booth next to you, the person's facial features or body language, you can tell they're responding to your conversation, even though they're trying to mask it. So that would be a backed up effect. And I was watching a documentary on the Persuaders, and one of the things they talk about is that central role of mimesis, to where businesses now don't sell a product. All laundry soap will get your clothes cleaned. All cars will get you from point A to point B. Nobody is selling a product anymore. All products are pretty much the same. They all do the job. You may have a preference for the way one looks, which would be style. But what businesses are selling now is that sense of belonging. So they use this contagion effect, this mimesis, this sense of giving you a sense of belonging, of place, of social bond, to actually sell products. So if you think of Jeep, people who own Jeeps and they're driving down the street and a Jeep passes a Jeep, they do the Jeep wave. They feel like they are part of a community. Tim Hortons, you know, they show all these people getting together, these great family moments, to where Tim Hortons are driving from one part of Canada all the way to the other, stopping at Tim Hortons, each one as you go, gives you the sense of you have a place, a sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. This is available, readily available community, which is a construct. It doesn't exist. There's people who buy Apple products, and because they love Apple computers and the iPod and the iPhone, and they can see themselves as a part of that community, so when they meet other people who have that same product, they've automatically have this sense of connection, like there is something about us that makes us the same. And there's a lot of universities, you know, the Alumnus Association, that's a huge part of belonging. And some universities really market that, and I think of St. FX, not that there's anything wrong with St. FX, I'm not saying that, but what a beautiful marketing ploy that, you know, you have the X-ring, and everywhere you go, you find somebody else who has the X-ring, and that's instantaneously, there's that sense of connection. And it's a powerful thing, and a lot of it comes through mimesis, and that is like, there's this visual cue of that X-ring that will convey a whole bunch of information to anybody who's an X-Man. They will actually, you know, have something. They'll feel that sense of community. And this is what businesses actually use, is the mimetic impulses. And now there are people who are huge fans of shows on TV that have now been turned into nothing but one long commercial. And it's flawlessly done, but that sense of belonging compels consumers to go out, and they are persuading themselves to purchase certain products based on this sense of mimesis, this sense of belonging, polis, place, political affiliation. All of these things are being deployed in the capitalist cultural industry. So continuing to read, and that has to do with a lot of Adorno, Althusser, Horkheimer. There's a pantheon of Marshall McLuhan. There's a pantheon of theorists who principally focus on that, and I would say Stanley Cavell would also be considered in that group. And those are the main ones I work with, but there's Foucault, Lacan, Derrida. I would even say Marx could be entered into this. Utilitarianist Mill could be entered into this. So it's a very complex situation that we find ourselves in, where mimesis, which is something that is overlooked, just like they say words don't have power, is overlooked, but these are things that are being deployed in the human experience by people who are organizing and orchestrating ideology in such a way that it's dismissed yet leveraged against the individual. And I find that's really interesting. It's a little unsettling at times, but it's quite interesting to actually study it and see how that actually operates. So, continuing reading. It conjures both discrete, I'm just backtracking a little bit, it conjures both, so affect and mimesis, conjures both the discrete affects and the frequent attempts to mask them, backed up affects. But the human face is also a diagram itself onto the sensuous qualities of other images in which it does not explicitly appear, so that the world can be facialized, even in the absence of faces. From the image of magazines as well as television, make use of the facialization in this way to conjure more complex representations of mood, including those sustained complexes of affects elaborated as emotions that may vary greatly culturally and historically. But the face is not the only vector of mediatized affect contagion. And what we're going to go into now is how there are things that represent, because we have been taught to read those like we would body language, where there's that recognition, and this is going to kind of tie back into the X-ring. Increasingly, graphic signs of logos, like Nike swoosh, the sound bite size of musical signatures of McDonald's, and the brief arrangement of notes with which our computers and mobile phones greet us, function at this level. They generate feelings that mobilize the body's capacity for synthesia. in which affect seems to act as a switchboard through which all sensory signals are passed. Both the sound and the image trace a typical pattern of arousal and plateau at the discrete affect of joy. Logos, whether visual or oral, evoke the elusive qualities captured by dynamic kinetic terms such as surging, fading, fleeting, fading away, explosive, crescendo, decrescendo, bursting, drawn out, and so on. It identifies with the activation contours of the discrete affects. These activation contours qualify the discrete affects corresponding to the pace of rising and falling levels of their arousal. Whether an affect is coming or going is information that is the conscript into semiotic systems of meaning. Joy arriving means something very different from joy departing or deflating. The temporal dimension is again brought into play. So there's something very temporal about our emotions, which is motivated through this contagious effect. So visual and musical logos orchestrate the activation contours of the discrete affects, both to incite our bodies into the immediate mimetic response, and in the same moment, by the same movement, to conscript affects into signature and into signification. So in a way, our body language has become the signifier of signified. So we can read each other what we're saying. When you're very close to someone, you can actually have an entire communication just through body language. So signifier, signified kind of signification, which is the base of language communication, now can be transferred to bodily communication, to where we don't need logos per se to actually carry on the exact type of communication. And that's the complexity of mimesis that Anna Gibbs is talking about, that before it was just like monkey see, monkey do, and there was mindless behind it. But the fact that mimicry can actually carry a very complex communication with a response in the other person that surpasses language. And that was one of the things where I was in the poem that I did, and there's several of the poems that I have that actually pick up on this, but to where there is bodily communication through mimicry, and I'm going to skip ahead in a moment and talk about how mimesis doesn't always mean mirroring and exact mimicry, but at times it can actually be the opposite, to where we are, because based on that masking effect, we can actually be resisting somebody and using mimicry very effectively, but by doing the subvertive of what that person is doing, by doing the opposite of mimicry, is also a form of mimicry. So in the main poem, I'm going to jump back to the poem really quick. One of the things that I noticed was there was this contagious effect when I walked into the superstore. So I said I knew the moment those cold glass doors slid open with an industrial hiss, the uncomfortable eyes probing, the fractured smiles seeking what? Mimicry, comfort, solace. The entire experience that I had was on a corporal level. It was all mimicry. When I walked in, people's body language was screaming at me. As I walked through the people who were the migrant farm workers, there was a huge body of information transferred. As I walked the aisles and I came across different people doing different things in response to this environment, all of the body language that was going on was sensationally audible. Like you could actually hear the conversation if you're in tune to it, and everybody seemed to be in tune to it. I mean, I'm verbalizing it, but everybody was engaged in this conversation, and to where there was a drawing together of people and a separating of people, and all of this transpired without anybody speaking a word. The language they used to each other there was nothing spectacular about it. It was just another day at the grocery store, but it was the facial features, the tightening of the vocal cords to where the tone of voices were changed. But what was most audible was the body language when nobody was talking, because it was really quiet. And it's a huge store. The Superstore is no small store, and it was deathly quiet. There was hardly any conversation taking place, and I thought that was probably the most telling of all. But all this communication was going on through the bodies. And I have this other things like the body screamed discomfort from rigid jaws clenched at teeth frozen and ice smiles. Every stranger's a suspect. I knew the breach of those faces probed my skull, seeking. So there was like they were trying to read the face of somebody. A shiver rippled through my soul. So it's where you actually can physically feel. You have that response within you on a chemical level, a musculature response to what you're seeing what you're seeing transpire before you, and now you're kind of being swept up into it because your body starts responding to both. For me, it was for both sides because I grew up here, but I know the history and I have family connection, not to those people particular, but to those countries particular, to where you can identify with and sympathize with. And that's one of the things that we're talking about. Mimicry depends on a certain empathy and sympathy for that communication to go on, whether you're resisting it or whether you're not resisting it, you're welcoming it, or whether it's even voluntary. To some point, this whole conversation will take place, and it's not a voluntary response. It just happens to you. It's almost as if that form of communication is invasive and it's thrust upon you, because your body will automatically respond based on its mimicry memory from before, growing up mimicking your parents. So I'm going to stop here, post this video, and then I will continue and we'll get into mimicry as in a way of protecting oneself, and then we'll wrap it up for Anna Gibbs.